Hello and welcome to a new Cabbie Conversations. I'm joined as usual by James and as a special guest is my brother George. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hiya.
So, before we get on to the main topic, James, we've been having a YouTube beef drama for many years with a mysterious fellow, and you finally get into the boxing ring with him. Most important question then you have to ask yourself is, what song would you play as you're walking out to face your rival?
What should we say? Is it Jake Paul? Is that his name?
I think so.
I can't say I really follow much popular YouTube, but isn't he a YouTuber?
I like to give a bit of an anecdote for these. But yeah, what would you play as you were walking out?
So I would want something with quite a lot of bass in it, and so I would probably go for there's a song by if anyone knows Royal Blood. My favorite Royal Blood song is Loose Change. It's got Royal Blood are a band with a bassist who's a singer and also a drummer, and the bass is really really rich, and it's quite. I think it has a good kick. So that's what I would come out to if I was going to Blazing or Guns in a Fight. But Tyson Fury, when he came out for one of his fights, he played Patsy Cline's Crazy for Me, which is kind of like creepy. It's like a love song about being obsessed with a lover. But it's just kind of funny how he played that. But anyway, Ed, what would you have for a fight to get you in the mood?
I'm thinking I would either like to go really, if I was actually trying to be like hard, I guess you'd say, I'd like to play something by Cabbage. I feel like that's something that would pump me up. If you haven't heard of Cabbage, which I guarantee most of you haven't, go and Google them and listen to some music.
Unless you're like a close friend of Ed's, which you will have most certainly heard of Cabbage.
Yeah. Either that, or if I was going something a bit campier, have you ever seen the film Space Jam? I think the main theme of that could work quite well. It would get the crowd all hyped up. Hopefully get them singing along. But when it came to the actual fight, I would turn and run away because I'm not good in a fight. I'm try and present I would use the song as a way to try and present an image that I am good in a fight, but I'm really not.
George, you're probably the most likely to win a fight out of the three of us. Therefore, what song would you choose?
Have you guys watched American Psycho?
Yeah.
Are you a fan of Huey Lewis and the News?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the earlier stuff was a bit too new age for my taste, but when they released 4 and It Hip to Be Square, they really came into their own, and so I'd definitely play Hip to Be Square.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably a bit too mainstream for you guys, but
not at all.
But I think if I was going to go into a fight, I mean, if I thought of those vibes in which Paul Allen is getting hacked to death to Hip to Be Square, I think that'll get me right in the mood. So
that's absolutely so true. It's funny you say American Psycho because I always associate Huey Lewis with Back to the Future.
That's fair enough. Yeah.
Which is like, so for me that would be like the opposite of a fight. But when you mentioned American Psycho, yeah, that is like exactly what you want to convey to your opponent.
That sounds pretty perfect to me.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that none of you said Eye of the Tiger. Like,
come on.
Well done, you guys. I personally, it's a dreadful song. I think it's a dreadful song. It's a no from me.
It's not a dreadful song. It's one of those things that's been overused, isn't it? It's like it's not the actual fault of the song. Just Rocky kind of made it so it was overused.
It's quite cliche. So well done for not cliche.
I put some actual effort into this podcast, James. Come on. I'm just gonna half-ass it with an answer like that. On a completely unrelated note, porn.
Yeah.
Got to get better at these segues. So yeah, there's a lot of avenues to the discussion we can have today. I guess the main thing we wanted to get at is, obviously societally, at the very least, porn has quite a negative connotation. It's sort of seen as a bit of a underground thing. No one really talks about it, at least not in mainstream circles. And there's been plenty of criticisms of it in recent years from, when I was doing my research, I mean, you guys can add to this, but I think a few of the most common criticisms I had of porn in general was can be degrading for women. It can warp people's views of sex. It can have sort of seedy connotations, like you don't know if the actors are fully consensual or not. All this sorts of stuff. So I guess I'll start with you, James. What is your overall opinion on these criticisms? Do you think they're valid?
So no, actually, I don't think they're valid. I read an initial article on Psychology Today, which was which debunked them, I think it called it the 7 myths of porn usage. And then I kind of from that did my own reading behind it with more I guess more firmer papers. And from what I read, no, I don't think porn usage is a bad thing. I think there can be ethical issues further down the line with say filming and the actors potentially.
Yeah.
But I think that the ethics around porn are similar to a lot of things that we consume in society. Some things are okay and some things aren't okay. And it's about doing your homework about where you choose to source your porn if you're going to use porn. That's my personal view, but yeah.
George, what do you think?
Right. So this is the point in which I get in trouble.
Not at all.
So first of all, I do on a personal basis, I do not think that I don't think that people should be. I don't think it's very good for people's psychology to have repeated exposure to nudity in a non-emotional manner. Pornography usage is almost day to day, and it's you sort of turn it into a daily activity of engaging very, very primitive and vulnerable areas of your brain. Now, you guys have brought up research, and of course, I have some conflicting things I might say. So, I mean, depending on how quickly we want to get into this, I can get into it quite quickly. But
should we pick say an area in particular?
Yeah, let's get specific, because you mentioned there's 7 myths or whatever. So there's plenty of areas you could say. So I guess the first one is, what do you think to the accusation that, let's start with the thing you mentioned, George, repeated exposure to sort of unemotional physical intimacy. This is something I read about as well. I think it does have, it's worth looking into, because I think there is an argument to be made that the vast majority of porn, not all, involves very sort of physically intensive, not emotional. There's not a lot of emotional intimacy there that's being presented. It's almost purely physical intimacy. So yeah, do you think that has an impact if people are viewing it? I don't think it's an exaggeration, like you say, George, to say that people watch it daily. I think that's most common for people. Do you think that can be harmful to people?
Well, I mean, the answer for me is, of course, yes. But I also believe that how harmful it is also changed in context depending on when the exposure happens. The most common exposure is, of course, in adolescents and adolescent boys. And generally, there have been a few papers published. I think there was a meta-analysis published of about 30 papers, which basically said that both physical and verbal violence during sex in teenage boys basically went up as a consequence of extended porn exposure. And you've got to remember that during the neuroplasticity in your brain diminishes considerably after you turn 20 or so. You start to become very fixed in your ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And changing those habits which have occurred during puberty become much harder. And so pornography exposure then in particular can be, at least to my understanding of the evidence, extremely damaging, not just for these lads, but also for, and of course, it's not only teenage boys who consume this, but women as well. But the effects seem to be most pronounced in boys. And that really seems to affect not only them, but their future partners.
What do you think, James?
Okay, so I did see a few studies like this because I knew George would talk about this. So the papers that I saw that especially discussed violent pornography within adolescents. If you want to talk about, say, porn usage and sexual crimes, but first of all, I'll come back. I'll
come back to that,
yeah. So it was with teenage boys, but children's cartoons are often more violent than hardcore pornography is. And it's actually the exposure to violence that actually increases violent behavior. It's not the exposure to sexual behavior that deviates the norm. So maybe there could be areas of it's more to do with the violence than it is to do with the sex. That's the issue. And also people who tend to have say a kink, say they're into, we discussed kinks in a previous episode. Maybe they do have a kink where they like to be more assertive and dominant and potentially aggressive, and somebody who likes to be more submissive and masochistic. But these kinks are often found before the age of 10. So if you have a predisposition or a preference for this is often actually innate and found there already, compared to and if you don't like something, you won't watch it. If you're not gay, you don't like gay porn. So it's sort of if you don't like violent sex, you don't like violent porn. So I think that the preening of violence in pornography might exist already from earlier childhood exposure, which isn't necessarily related to sex, and so therefore not inherently related to porn.
You're saying rather than the porn shaping your view of it, you sort of are drawn to it as like an inverse type thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's inherently the sexual act that leads to domestic violence. And what's interesting is where porn usage is widely used, and this is found across cultures, especially, and this was done in the 70s and 80s across cultures, and the 60s in Denmark, Sweden, and the US. They found that crimes related to sex decreased as porn usage became more widespread, which kind of shows that if people
I think I know the papers you're talking about.
Yeah. If people are open to sexual expression that's not seen as a shameful act, then there is less need to kind of almost physically take sex from women almost. And it's also seen that sex is not a shameful act. Sex is about pleasure, and I think what good porn does well is it shows equal parties enjoying themselves, which therefore also shows that both the dominant and the submissive persona in sex are both deserve pleasure, because you could be watching gay porn, you could be watching straight porn, and so both parties are deserving of pleasure and deserve to have a good time. And I think that is a good thing about porn, and it encourages people to explore their sexual tastes. Later on in the 80s, there was found to be, you could argue, a greater instance of sexual assault. However, this was still lower than the non-sexual violent crimes, prevalence of non-sexual violent crimes. But this rise in rape and non-sexual assault is because the legal definition of rape changed. So before, it was kind of viewed as just if a gang came along and raped you, then that was rape. And if your husband wanted to have sex with you and you didn't, that was not rape.
Yeah.
But as the definition of rape has broadened, of course, there's going to be more incidences of rape. And so I don't think that can be accredited to porn use, but I think that's accredited to societal changes being more understanding and more aware about what consent is instead of pornography use.
What do you think, George?
Right. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there. So the first thing is that those papers which reference Denmark in particular, I think, is the big one. Used they didn't use any control tools. They basically just had a threshold timeline, and they said, well, this happened, then this happened, and it was a relatively unsophisticated paper. There have been longitudinal OLSs on people of
George, what is an OLS for people who don't know?
Sure. Okay.
Like me and James.
An OLS is a form of regression. It's the most basic form of regression, in which you basically try and construct the model with the most explanatory power with using the simplest amount of mathematical parameters.
Right.
It is about trying to explain as much as you can with as little as you can. And as a general rule, crime has been falling. This is correct. The reasons for that are vague. One of the most common reasons cited is the fall in the lead supply, particularly in the United States, but that might be in Scandinavia as well. I don't know about that. But that paper in general wasn't very good. Anyway, enough of a spurg about that. What I would say is that there is a lot of evidence which has gone around, which shows that people who are exposed to porn for a long time have serious negative effects. So, for example, most around 80 to 90% of people report decreased attraction to their partners over the period of a year after watching porn. Divorce probability goes up by 83.3% if the husband uses porn. Men who use more porn cannot sexually satisfy their wives, as a general rule. Pornography has been shown to lower working memory and IQ. And in fact, there was a very, very interesting paper published just this year, which found that so your brain, your neurological functions, you have impulses, and those are controlled by black and white, gray and white matter. And what one of these papers has just found that white matter, which is highly dependent on myelin sheath, which is this fatty thing which insulates the electrical pulses to lots of other areas of your brain function, actually decays under using lots of after using a lot of pornography. Now, how that happens, or if there's not some confounding variables, remains to be seen. But I mean, I saw this paper, and if it means something, then 20% of people who start using porn in 3 years' time will have watched child pornography. I mean, I can go on and on about this stuff. For example, there is pornography has been shown to men to actually dehumanize, start viewing women as objects, in contrast to sex positivity sort of mantra. For example, men who have had repeated exposure to porn often view women's competence as lower, their morality is lower, and their intellectual capability.
I'm going to stop you right there because I have found contradictory evidence for that in repeated studies, and also that looking at feminist movements, the radical feminists are against pornography because they see it, like you said, as men taking power away from women. However, liberal feminists view it as a more pleasure-focused activity for both men and women, and that often and contradictory studies to what you have found, such as Rees in 1986 and Paydeget et al. In 89 found that gender equality views were greater in those who watched porn than those who did not. So there is clearly some contradictory opinion out in the sphere.
The problem with that is that you are contrasting people who you have a selection bias there, because people who didn't already watch it likely have different views. They might be from religious fundamentalist backgrounds. What you're more interested in is looking at the change over time. I have a paper here, I believe it's a meta-analysis. Yes, it's the review of the research, which takes a alternative point of view. It looks at 27 papers and says, as I've said before, the problem, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are people who don't watch porn who are terrible pieces of that. Does not mean that does not mean that that does not mean it's, you know, that the acts of porn do not in of themselves have some very, very damaging effects.
With what you were saying about how porn causes relationship problems. So in a relationship, no two couples have the same sexual taste, just like in a relationship, no two couples like exactly the same food to the exact same amount. However, you can choose, if you don't want to eat something, you can eat something else. But in most relationships, since they're monogamous, not that there's a problem at all with polyamory if you're interested in that, or involved, or interested in, or your partners are interested in different kinds of kinks that would involve group sex or cuckolding, for example. It therefore means that that one of the partners will not have all their sexual, or both partners might not have all their sexual needs met. And to me, if you both want to stay in a monogamous relationship, porn provides a good outlet for that to happen. It provides a space where somebody can satisfy that sexual need without feeling the need to be unfaithful to their partner. I know that some women in particular, when I've spoken to them about porn, are uncomfortable with the fact that their partner is, I guess, receiving pleasure, say, from in a heterosexual relationship from viewing another woman in a sexual light. But if we look at sex in a people often, when people watch porn and you ask them why you watch porn, they often say it's for a fantasy, it's for an escape, it's for a release, which is not the same necessarily the same grounds as pornography. I mean, romantic sex with a partner. Romantic sex with a partner is all about communication and a mutual shared pleasure. Whereas if that party is not interested in that shared pleasure, I would say it's okay within the grounds of the relationship to find that release elsewhere while still remaining faithful to that partner.
I mean, the direct problem with that is the evidence directly contradicts it. I mean, I've been through this before, but, you know, pornography usage will increase divorce probability by 83.3%.
I think it depends on what both partners have a view on about pornography.
And in general, extra promiscuity also predicts divorce. If you're not able to sexually satisfy each other, I would question if that's the fault of quote the need to rely on something else, or if it's more something that's at work within the relationship itself. Now, I'm no relationship specialist. I've had exactly one relationship. I make this basis more on empirical evidence. So,
well, I
I,
mean, in a
I
relationship,
yeah.
people
Just one
sometimes
sec
get.
before we go off track. I'm just going to say, I'm going to
Yes,
take the
Steven.
bitchy middle ground here and say, I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of this research, from what I've read and from what you both said, I think a lot of this comes down to studies of people. And like George mentioned, there can be lots of sort of coagulating dependencies and variables that we don't really know about. It reminds me a lot of back in the day, I had a very long debate with somebody about whether video games cause violence. And a lot of the same studies and methodology was used there. So the thing is, it's very difficult to say, tie, for example, whether somebody views women as inferior because they watch porn. Much like, and similarly, it's very difficult to say that porn improves body positivity because there's so many other variables at play here, like, you know, what you were born, like how you were raised, whether what experiences you've had when you were younger. I think that I think it's a bit naive to say that it has no, like porn has no real impact on people's perception of sex, especially if you watch a lot of it, which I would argue most straight males do watch a fair amount of it. But I would question, I guess, how far that makes you, that transforms your psyche, at least on its own. So yeah,
can I piggyback off that?
Yeah, go on.
So, the important thing to note here is that I don't. When I talk about studies, I mean you're absolutely right. Most studies do a what we would call a difference in differences thing, and they would just say it looks like this then, and it looks like this now, so this is what we see. I always try to strive, and particularly with this sort of research, in which is so much confounding, because of course, these are human beings. Not is one variable. I believe internet pornography is a very powerful and dangerous variable, but it is nonetheless one variable. There are other things going on in people's lives, but most of the stuff I use are generally either controlled time trials or regressions, and those can be controlled for, those can be understood in their proper context. So for example, you brought up video games and their violence. So one of the things you can do is you can look at areas of the brain which are affected by violence, and you can see over a period of time for exposure. For example, in rats, you can expose them to fights between other rats and see if that affects their violent tendencies in a month's time. And you can also do the same with sexual violence, or rats raping other rats. And the evidence seems to suggest that violence predicts this sort of thing, but sexual violence predicts it even more. Now, of course, those are rats, so how does that generalize onto humans? Well, again, it's complicated, but one of the things we do know about, in particular with regards to neurological research, is in your brain you have three structures. You have your lizard brain at your bottom, and you have your limbic system, which controls your emotions and where you feel pleasure. It's all the stuff where cocaine, sex, all that generalized stuff goes
Good
into
stuff.
there. And then you have neurological stuff in which your brain calculates things like 2 + 2 = 4. And it's also the stuff that inhibits you from your impulses. And one of those impulses is having risky, dangerous sex. And the part of your brain most responsible for that is your anterior frontal lobe. And there have been a dearth of studies over the past few years showing that sustained exposure to highly stimulatory limbic system material like pornography can actually not destroy, but decay those areas, because you are repeatedly breaking that barrier. And so your anterior frontal lobe, gets just less and less potent at holding you back, and you become more susceptible to other addictions, and it becomes a runaway cycle.
So you would claim porn to be an addiction?
Yes, absolutely.
However, there is no porn addiction in the DSM-5, and all medical bodies and all psychological bodies do not believe porn to be an addiction. They do. So there is something called hypersexual disorder, which is in the DSM-5, which is a persistent, repetitive sexual impulse or urges. But I'd say that most people's porn use is not something that interferes with their health, interferes with their work, and interferes with their general social relationships. They're not going to stop. They're not going to miss spending time with their friends, say if they're single, because they're watching porn. I don't think that's something that really happens very often. I do think that the internet is increasingly being gauged as an addiction process, and where porn is potentially addictive, they're seeing it as more of a wider internet addiction, and porn being one of the routes. Like video games may be another route, or TikTok may be another route, but they're seeing it more under a more general addiction to the internet, rather than a sex-related disorder.
Okay. First thing to jump on then is definitions and psychometric. First of all, pornography, at least in the widespread and videographic way that we see it, is novel, and there hasn't been a lot of time to get around it. But more importantly, psychological associations have reluctantly created things like autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, post-traumatic stress disorder. What people say in the past, regardless of a matter of esteem, is rather, at least in my opinion, irrelevant. What matters is the data. And the data has shown, for example, that pornography addiction, because it releases dopamine, and dopamine is a classic feel-good drug. And the higher the dopamine in your body, the more your receptors die down. So you need to have more intense ways to receive the same level of dopamine.
Your brain always wants more dopamine.
Yeah, your brain always wants more dopamine. And in pornography, there is a logical way of doing it, and that's by viewing more extreme and vilifying stuff. That's well replicated. And going
Would
beyond
you consider
that,
go on, you finish.
Okay, right. No, don't worry. All right, carry on.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, do you think, because on that same metric, there's lots of things that release dopamine. Would you consider Coca-Cola or something like that addictive? I mean,
Well,
there's certainly an argument for it.
Yes. So sugar and cocaine have similar levels of addictive capacity. Now, of course, cocaine is much more. The effects happen much sooner. The effects of pornography, for example, they're more subtle.
Yeah.
They do take their time, and I won't deny that. But the evidence does suggest that they do take an effect. not just on you, but on your loved ones. And and one of those things is that, and one of the most obvious ones is that leads you closer to being fallen to other addictions. And also the other thing is that certain things you can do which give you dopaminergic kicks are healthy. Having sex with your loving partner, very healthy thing to do. Taking a cold shower, great idea, boost metabolism. Having the occasional drink, not too bad. But other things like sustained cocaine, sugar, or pornography use, apart from giving you a high, are actually very negative for your psychological well-being and your physical well-being, for that matter.
I guess I would just, I think it just, to classify porn as an addiction, I think it requires quite a broad definition of the word, because something like nicotine is obviously addictive because it's got chemicals in it that make it addictive. But once you start getting onto things that are purely like not, they're not something you ingest physically, and it's something that I just think it requires too broad of a term, like something that just releases dopamine. I mean, that's so many things.
It's not the fact that it releases dopamine per se. It's the fact that because if it just releases dopamine, then I would say who cares. It's the fact there's a lot of bad things associated with it, which makes it the problem. So, for example, if psychopaths, if their addiction was eating apples, we wouldn't care about psychopaths, but their actual addiction is killing people, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's the tripping point.
It's true.
And so, yeah, that's why and also the fact that so if I let's say I started getting addicted to eating apples, and so instead of one apple, I now eat 2 apples a day. Who cares? But for a person consuming pornography, let's say the average heterosexual porn doesn't work. Now they have to watch, I don't know, porn containing defecation, and then it might actually reach child pornography, which does happen in about 10 to 20% of cases. So, it's started off as something very anodyne. And as opposed to me now eating 10 apples a day, I am now supporting a villainous industry.
I can see your point. I do think it can be a bit of a logic leap. And it requires, and I guess at the end of the day, it depends on whether you think that consuming a lot of pornography in general is like you say, if it has a detrimental impact, which obviously we've shown that we all think very differently on that. But I just wanted to move on to one last thing, a slightly different aspect of it, which is, do you think that the sort of underground nature of the porn industry means that you run a high risk of, say, I believe it was, NCM, so non-consensual material. Do you think that this poses an issue? And if so, what do you think we can do to resolve it? So James, what do you think?
I do think it's an issue, but I think as much the thing is that most people watch, the vast majority of more than half the population watches porn. So roughly in the 2000s, it was about 3 out of 10 women watch porn and about 9 out of 10 men watch porn. That's probably risen since the internet has become more widespread and you don't have to worry about wanking on your family computer. You can now do it on your phone.
Yeah, probably. You're absolutely
right. So thinking about how widespread and easily accessible porn is, I would say that education is important. around porn, and children need to have a discussion about porn, and part of that is what happens when you see child pornography. When you see child pornography, you need to learn that if you see it, you should report it, because of course it's not ethical, and I'm totally against. Or if you don't like the content of something, then you should know how to flag it and send it off. I think that's what we would do if we were watching YouTube. I think the same process should be applied with porn, and I think that should be just common practice and common sense.
What do you think, George?
Well, I actually know someone who's doing some work on this at the moment, who I can't really disclose his name, but one of the things you can do that's actually becoming quite easy is you have the ability to tell when someone is what you can do is you can give basically a bot loads and loads of images of different sexual actions, and you can show faces in which the person is consenting and when the person is not consenting. And you can even do that for pornographic material in which the person is supposedly consenting or not consenting. Now, if you give the bot enough images, they can, with 99.6% accuracy, be able to tell whether that image contains someone consenting or not consenting. And so what the sort of area of work that I'm really interested in, which is machine learning, which is dominated by this sort of action. What we are hoping to do is we can actually start making really, really quick, fast, effective, corrective material that can basically get rid of this plague before it gets too bad. And that's what I think is something to be looked forward to in the future, is the fact that we can get bots which are smarter at this than we are, and effectively curtail the problem without us even needing to flag it.
That's pretty crazy. I had no idea that was even a thing.
Oh yeah,
that's fun.
Yeah.
Oh, technology.
No,
what about if, like, you know, because a lot of it is, as we talked about, a lot of porn is quite like based in like role play. How is the computer able to differentiate when, say, someone is like faking it, basically?
Well, I suspect what you could do is you could give it a sub-training group in which you could, like, I mean, I personally would ban pornography altogether, but of course we all differ on that. But you could give the bot you can give the bot it would have to be quite a lot of information because the difference is very subtle.
Yeah.
But if you have enough information on what a consensual hardcore act is and a non-consensual hardcore act is, the bot would be able to figure it out eventually. But would I personally I mean, I wouldn't personally deploy it on such a minuscule scale, but for people who are more positive about free sexual expression, then, you know, that might be up to them. Yeah. But it is definitely feasible.
Yeah, it's interesting, if nothing else. It's I find this stuff very interesting. Yeah, it's I think it's unfortunately one of those things that I do almost think that because the industry is almost quite, it is heavily regulated legally, but I think that it often, for the sake of PR, so obviously you don't find porn ads on like Facebook. You know, the porn sites are forced into this sort of small corner of I say small, they're forced into a certain corner of the internet that isn't exposed to people on a daily basis, you know, much like unlike something like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or whatever. And I think that does sort of contribute to the fact that this sort of underground aspect to it can lead it towards this sort of there being a higher risk of non-consensual material, perhaps even like worse than that, illegal material, all this stuff. So I guess the question is, do you go with George's view and just ban it altogether, or do you try and maybe promote a more positive outlook on it so that people are more accepting of it, and then it gets more in the public eye, and then we can hold these people more to account? That's an open question.
I would say that you can ban porn. People will still find porn. It's like drugs. You can make drugs illegal. People will still take drugs. And if anything, if you ban it, it will make it more of a thrill to find it, and it could potentially make it more dangerous and increase the risk of human trafficking and stuff. Not, I'm totally for all different kinds of kinks as long as they're consensual, but trafficking is something that I'm not too keen on.
You're not into the kink of trafficking.
It's not a kink.
No, it's not. Just to make that clear.
So I think what you can do really is, because like George said, it's predominantly young people who are finding porn, and often people start Googling about sex at the age, it's around 10 years old really, so quite early on. So if you're going, I think children are on the internet from the word go these days. So the most important thing that you can do is educate them about it, educate them about potential risks, and also I'd say potential benefits. I think if a woman freely chooses to be a porn star, then it's a very good way of making an income. And if she enjoys it, I don't see why there's any way that she shouldn't make good money doing it. However, if she is coerced, then that is of course a completely different subject to me. Can there be laws to maybe make it safer? Yeah, I think there probably could, but I don't think banning porn, whether you agree with it or not, will change the issue. And I think that for some people, so not everybody can have sex too. Maybe it's because of severe anxiety which they can't get over. Maybe it's because they have a disability. It could be for all sorts of reasons, but porn also allows other people access to a world that they might not otherwise have. So for me, I think that's a good thing about porn. And if you are ashamed of sex, porn might be a way for you to explore, or parts of your sex life. Porn might be a way of dipping your toe into seeing what you might like, instead of having to expose yourself in front of a partner when you're not ready to. So I think there are definitely good aspects to porn, and I think prohibition will not solve those problems.
Okay, so the first thing we need to take off then is prohibition. So whether people will still find porn. The answer is yes, but the numbers will be much, much smaller than they currently are. And if it's a bad thing, like I hold it is, then that's net social good. So for example, with prohibition, people often have this in their head that prohibition was this period of immense anarchy and people drank more than they ever did. It's actually wrong. Alcohol, don't get me wrong, I'm fine with alcohol consumption, but alcohol consumption declined 90% during prohibition, whether you use official or unofficial statistics. With regards loneliness and social anxiety, pornography again has a negative effect. So going back to what I said about dopaminergic rewards, when you engage in pornography, you are gaining sexual gratification very easily. Normally, and particularly for young men who normally need a lot of motivation to go get out and talk to a woman, if the easy alternative is to just lie down and relax in a gentlemanly fashion, that is a huge opportunity loss. And there is really strong evidence of people who escape pornography that they become more pro-social within about a year or so. With regards to how such a banning could be enforced, I think it's actually much easier. And the reason it's much easier is because it's online. Unlike other things as well, like drugs, which are physical, pornography is distributed through a network in which you can also deploy computer algorithms. And computer algorithms are highly, highly efficient at this sort of thing. I can type in someone can type in a regular expression which says, find all videos which says this, and this, or contains this in their subtitles, and boom, they'll be gone from the internet within 24 hours. It's not hard. It can be done. It's up to us to decide whether we want to do that. Now, I understand some people don't want to do that. Of course, I'm a far more conservative person here, so I'm of course happy to be the social enforcer, but I accept that most people are not so paternalistic. But with regards to the capability and the effectiveness of such actions, I do believe it could work.
There's always stories, though, I mean, of like child porn and stuff, and that's obviously still a huge issue. Like, and that's obviously almost purely digital. So
well, yes.
I guess, yeah.
So most of that goes through under the deep web, and part of the reason that is not taken account of is because the government isn't very good at handling the deep web, because it's complicated and it's big.
They're all old. They don't know what it is.
And yeah, and you know, most of the Tories are grey-haired men.
Yeah.
But you can handle it, and so child pornography, not normally what happens in child pornography is that it's not actually spread online. What people normally do is they build up local networks, which are these little things in which you basically share a hyper intense internet connection with one other person. And so one person pays, I don't know how much ever child pornography costs, and then it's transferred across.
Thing.
Yeah. And that's going to be harder to deal with. But going back to what I said about prohibition and all those, and those other examples, if you can decrease something by 90%, are you willing to tolerate that 10% to still exist? And I would say yes, honestly, because for me, life is not about having the freedom to make stupid decisions. It's about having the ability to make the right decisions and to do the best for everyone around you. And from the preponderance of evidence that I have come across, pornography does not help people. It hurts them quite profoundly.
Fair enough. Does anybody else have anything else to add?
I mean, George and I have discussed this at length, but I mean, where do you lie within this?
No, I've just been sort of taking it in. I'm very interested. You've both been like providing very good arguments on either side. I guess my bottom line is I overall I think I just treat it like any sort of, well, like anything really. It's fine in moderation. I think there are absolutely risks associated, both for the people involved in the making of it and for the people consuming it. And I think, James, we come to this conclusion almost every time on this podcast, but the real solution is education. I'm very much a proponent in people being allowed to basically do what they want, as long as they're not hurting other people. And I'm also particularly, I guess, a proponent of people exploring their own sexuality and whatever. And porn can be a way of doing that. Now, I won't lie and say that the porn industry as it is now is a very good and ethical place. It's really not. it really does need some sort of drastic improvement, I think. And I think, in my view, the best way to go about this would be to sort of make it more in the public eye, not in a forceful way, but sort of remove some of the underground sort of weird stigma it has, where, you know, it's just sort of not talked about and shut down any opportunity. Which I guess is part of the reason I want to talk about it on this podcast.
Yeah.
But I really, this is a very, very fruitful discussion. I really enjoyed it. Does anyone else have any last things to add?
I think what was quite interesting was was Britain's role in porn, because the Brits are known to be prudes. And so what I would say is the Longford Committee, while all of these studies were going across the US and Scandinavia and West Germany at the time about a more, I guess, sexually open view, the Brits are very much like, no, this is deviant behavior. And it wasn't until 2007 when a guy called, I think it was Popovich, changed the general opinion within the government, whether you agree or not, the consent. So it's kind of long standing within the UK, in the British psyche, that porn is deviant behavior, whether you agree with that or not. And so it's interesting to see how this culture permeates into how it's not in our discussion, like you would say. And whether you agree or disagree, I think it's an important discussion to have.
No, absolutely. I think not talking about it is the worst outcome of all, and not thinking about it, even if, as I'm sure, like George's mysterious friend, I think it's kind of good that they're developing these softwares and stuff to actually try and help to solve this situation. But yeah,
he's more of an acquaintance, but yes, it's a mysterious
mysterious acquaintance. Nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us.
Cheers.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.